Howdy folks, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you I have a Bjorn's Mighty Thoughts video. For you, those of you that are new here, this is a type of podcast video where I'm picking a certain subject and I'm going to talk about it for a bit. It's just some random subject I decide on. And today's subject is actually going to be on the TIE Fighter of the Star Wars galaxy. The reason I'm doing this is because I was asked a question a while ago, and I really couldn't give a good answer to that question because, well, there was a lot of people in the Discord at the time having various different conversations. So I made it as short and sweet of an answer as possible. However, I actually decided today to finally go more in depth with that answer. So what was the question? Well, why the Galactic Empire, who can build essentially a giant death laser in space, uses the TIE Fighter? Probably the worst fighter in the Star Wars universe. Well, okay, I'm going to dive into a bit of that here. I'm going to roll some Star Wars Squadrons footage, and I'm going to talk a bit about that. Now, what it really has to do with and why they have to use the TIE Fighter has to do with Moff Tarkin. See, after the Clone Wars, Moff Tarkin wrote, I'll just call him Tarkin from now on, by the way. Tarkin wrote a doctrine called the Tarkin Doctrine. That doctrine was built around lessons learned from the Clone Wars, especially when it came to space fleet battles. So, the doctrine was written around the idea of using massive capital ships to essentially enforce the galaxy. The galaxy was quite large, and they would need to patrol vast sectors of space with generally armies at the ready. Hence is why they used the Star Destroyer, because you could actually load up quite a few troops onto it as well as starfighters, and that's actually what we'll get into. See, the doctrine was written around the idea of ships like Star Destroyers, cruisers, and other ships as well would essentially be the Empire's fist. They would patrol the galaxy if there was any type of planetary issue. They would either use planetary bombardments or they would land troops that were stationed on the ships. Fighters were not used to patrol the galaxy. Even at that time, it was quite uncommon for a fighter to patrol the galaxy. Now, the doctrine was written around the idea of these ships, Star Destroyers in particular, would actually have a contingent of fighters on them to act as interceptors. So a design was put forth that they wanted the fighters to be small, cheap, easy to mass produce, but effective. See, when you got to build a hell of a lot of starfighters, the credits really start stacking up. Starfighters are actually quite expensive. Now, that being said, there was a lot of different areas they skimmed out on. One area was shields. Now, TIE Fighters generally don't have shields. This is not for all models of TIE Fighters. Some of the more specialized variants do, but your TIE Fighters, your TIE Interceptors, and even your TIE Bombers don't have shields. And that's actually to keep its production costs down, keep its size small. The next thing, too, that was actually skipped out on was a life support system. Why was a life support system skipped out on? Well, that's also, once again, to keep the ship small, keep it cheap, and actually it was cheaper to have a pilot suit with a built-in life support system over having the ship with a life support system built into it. At least for the Empire, it was. This is not always going to be the case. For something along the lines of like a planetary defense force or a small rebellion fleet, that would not be the case. But when you consider the uniforms are mass produced and things of that nature, it does become cheap. Next thing they skipped out on was also torpedoes and concussion missiles. Understand that torpedoes and concussion missiles are more or less something that you don't really use against fighters themselves, and you use them more against capital ships. Now that being said as well, because these are interceptors, they have capital ships providing support, so they don't need that kind of firepower. Once again, because of how the doctrine is written, the ships can be made smaller, made cheaper, easier to mass produce. See where I'm going with this? Everything around the ship is to keep it small, cheap, mass produced. Now, when it comes to flight speed itself, outside of hyperspace, it is actually one of the fastest starfighters in the galaxy, top speed wise. I'm not quite sure if it's the fastest. I actually really haven't had any proof of a starfighter or any other ship actually being faster though than a TIE fighter, short of, I believe, the TIE Interceptor. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So we've skipped out on, I've essentially explained all the different things that they skipped out on. Next thing, because they also didn't have a hyperdrive, once again, they were reliant on the Star Destroyers to get from point A to point B, which did have hyperdrives, which did have navigation computers. Once again, more stuff that was actually skimped out on, keeping the production costs down, keeping the size smaller. So essentially what you have is you have a pilot pod with a power source, an engine, wings, laser cannons, pilot controls. Pretty much what you see here as basically bare bones as you can get it for a fighter. Now that being said, there's a lot of misconceptions about ships like the Y-Wing being better than the TIE Fighter, as well as the X-Wing. And I'm really going to explain that as that's actually rebellion propaganda, believe it or not. Yes, folks, I said rebellion propaganda. Now, I want to do some quick comparisons here. Size comparison. Now, the Y-Wing is a multi-role bomber. It's a light bomber. It's a tactical bomber. And it makes the ship quite larger than a typical fighter would be. It's actually one of the largest fighter category ships in Star Wars, if not the largest, especially in the realm of length. That being said, it also did have shields, and it actually had some quite powerful shields for its time. But that being said, it was also a limited production prototype bomber. And there wasn't actually a whole lot of Y-Wings made. That being said, they were almost 3 times the length of a TIE fighter and almost twice as wide, if not twice as wide or a little bit more. In the case of the X-Wing was actually literally the most advanced multi-rolled starship of its time. It featured a hyperdrive, quite powerful shields for a standard fighter, when considering that most starfighters either skimped on shields in general or actually had really weak shielding, surprisingly. It also had quite a lot of firepower. This was a specialized ship. Well, it wasn't a specialized ship, but it was a multi-role, multi-purpose ship that was built with the most advanced technology at the time. And essentially, when it comes to the starfighters, it is the Cadillac. However, that being said, it was almost 3 times the price tag of a TIE fighter, so you can literally build 3 TIE fighters in place of 1 X-Wing. Plus, once again, it was twice the size, and it was just slightly, it was just about twice the length and only slightly wider than the TIE fighter. Like, we're talking like 1.5 width of the TIE fighter. So it was, once again, a larger ship. However, there was also some flaws in the X-Wing as well. One is while it did have some advanced ballistic computers or fire control systems, the fire control systems were actually not refined enough to really effectively lock onto the TIE fighter. Now, the TIE fighter's fire control systems actually was quite effective, especially against the X-Wing. Next thing is too, it's, as I said, it's got shields, it's got torpedoes, it's got hyperdrive. It's got a lot of things that the TIE Fighter doesn't have. It even actually had a built-in life support system. So we're talking that the X-Wing is literally the Cadillac. Now that being said too, well, the next thing that comes up is the TIE Fighter pilot. We need to talk about the TIE Fighter pilot before I can really paint a full picture here about everything. See, the Empire was a galactic standardized military. They actually had time to sit down and set up their regiments of what their training's going to be, what the requirements are going to be, actually take time to train the pilots. I think, if I recall, I saw somewhere it was a 18-week training cycle, but it may have been longer for a TIE Fighter pilot. And essentially, they only picked the best of the TIE Fighter pilots. Roughly 12% of the pilots that would pass essentially flight training were TIE Fighter pilots. The vast majority of pilots did other stuff, such as supply ships, landing ships like the Lambda shuttle, etc. So they had actually some of the best pilots in the galaxy. Now let me paint another picture here for you too, because I said earlier about rebel propaganda. The thing to understand is in the films and the shows, the only time we see the TIE Fighters losing, or the TIE Fighters in general in combat, they're on the losing side. That is because of just how essentially things had rolled out. But understand that it was a 5-year, the rebellion was a 5-year hot war. And actually, more often than not, when it came to encounters where TIE Fighters were actually engaging X-Wings, more often than not, TIE Fighters were actually the victor. The primary tactic used by the rebellion, which is why the X-Wing works superbly for the rebellion, was hit and run tactics. They would hit a target and run away before the Empire could react. Now, next thing everyone's probably going to say, because I'm painting this picture about how great the TIE Fighter actually is in combat due to its small size and things of that nature, if it was so effective, why didn't the rebellion try to clone it? They did, actually. They did something very similar. Now, this is a bit more advanced and slightly larger than your typical TIE Fighter, but the A-Wing was actually built on the process of the thought process of a fast, very maneuverable, small-sized ship with a lot of firepower in the hood. And that's what the A-Wing was. Now, once again, the A-Wing was actually really late towards the rebellion. And there wasn't a whole lot of them produced, because they were actually quite expensive. And actually, they really weren't all that effective at the time. And that's actually not because of the ship. That's actually because of training. The rebellion pilots just did not have the training. After the rebellion was over and the New Republic had time to actually train their pilots, the effectiveness of the A-Wing really started to shine. However, that being said, it was still only an interceptor and only meant to be an interceptor. So anything along the lines of these long-range hit-and-run patrols or anything like that was out of the question. That's not what the A-Wing was built for. And primarily, the New Republic would use the X-Wing more often than not because of the different advantages the X-Wing would have over all other ships in the fleet. This is including the B-Wing, which I'm not really counting too much in this discussion because, once again, that's a highly specialized fighter. Well, it's actually a bomber. Now, that being said, once again, if the TIE Fighter was so great, or actually so poor, why didn't they build more advanced models? Well, they did. I give you the advanced TIE Fighter, and I give you the TIE Defender. Now, there was even other models, such as the Phantom TIE. I'm only going to highlight those two, because one, the advanced TIE Fighter originally was produced with the idea of it being a commander's TIE fighter. Your wing commander would use the advanced TIE. Darth Vader had his own version, but he had like a completely different prototype from the typical advanced TIE. And the TIE fighter, then there was the advanced TIE fighter would actually lead to the Interceptor. And I'm going to, once again, talk about the Interceptor here in a bit, folks, so bear with me. And then you had the TIE Defender. And the problem is with the TIE Defender is it was actually an extremely complex ship. It was highly specialized. And I want to say there was only ever like a dozen of them built. It was more or less, it was a prototype that never hit mass production stage. They were actually really good and really effective, especially against the Rebellion. But that being said, it was also quite expensive to build compared to your typical TIE fighter. Why are we building this thing when we can build, 5 TIE fighters in its place? Stuff like that. Plus, it needed specialized facilities for landing, refitting, and etc. Besides the refitting, that is actually one thing I have missed about talking about with the TIE fighter, is also because of its simplistic design and its lack of different features like life support, hyperdrive, torpedo launchers, etc. It's actually really easy to maintain when they're going to be maintained. And the Empire maintains their ships actually quite often. Once again, an actual military. Plus, they have trained mechanics with top-notch facilities compared to the Rebellion, which you can't say the same thing. See the Y-Wing. See the Y-Wing from the Clone Wars versus the Y-Wing during the Rebellion era. Yeah, they're actually the same ship, interestingly enough. Okay, the final thing, I keep alluding to it, is the TIE Interceptor. Why do I keep talking about the TIE Interceptor? Well, I keep talking about the TIE Interceptors because the TIE fighter was actually so effective at what it did, but technology had progressed over the time that it was in service, that new technology was made available, more funding was put in place, and another more modernized design of the TIE fighter was ready for production, and that would actually be the Interceptor. The Interceptor would actually take everything the TIE fighter was and did it better. It had 2 additional laser cannons, and that was really it in its design. The design structure, you can split it either way. I've seen it you could argue that the design structure was the same or better. I think the design structure itself was actually better, but it was also a slightly more advanced, more expensive ship cost-wise. That being said, it was also a better ship, and it was when it was time to roll out the TIE Interceptor, and it was decided that the TIE Interceptor was going to be accepted for service. It was decided to actually completely replace the TIE Fighter with the TIE Interceptor. Because, as I said, the TIE Interceptor was everything that the TIE Fighter was and improved. However, it just didn't happen because, well, the war ended. It came late during the Rebellion, and it just never reached mass production numbers because of that. So it would actually serve with the TIE Fighter for its service. Anyway, folks, that's actually going to wrap up my discussion about the TIE Fighter. Hopefully you all enjoyed the video. I know I jumbled around a bit, but folks, I do this kind of stuff off the cuff. There is no script here written. So anyway, folks, thank you very much for tuning in. Hopefully you all enjoyed the video, and have yourself a wonderful day.